Hey, I'm Yakov and this is the Swift Bird, a blog about tech, software and birds. From time to time I cover some of my own projects on this channel, and in this video I'll tell you about how I rewrote the Caffeine app in Swift. If you find this video helpful or at least entertaining, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. You can also support me with a small donation at the links below. Now let's get started. Caffeine is a small Mac utility which prevents the computer from going to sleep. It was originally published back in the mid-2000s and last updated over 10 years ago. Since then, the company behind Caffeine has gone out of business, but luckily it open sourced the code. Ever since I learned about Caffeine, I used it nearly every day for reading long documents, exporting videos and doing other tasks. But as macOS evolved, Caffeine's degraded to the point where the Mac refused to even launch the app, just because it wasn't signed with a valid certificate. And at that point, I decided to do something about it. In my previous video on Caffeine, I explained what I found in the open source repo and what I did to modernize the app. I reused the original Objective-C codebase, and the result was good enough to put the app on the App Store. But if you're familiar with both Objective-C and Swift, you know how much you can improve and optimize by switching to the new language. And that's exactly what I did. I wanted to preserve the look and feel that users expected from Caffeine. And because of that, I didn't feel comfortable to just scrap the old code and write new one from scratch. Instead, I followed the step-by-step approach, literally translating the code first and then refactoring it with Swift native solutions. When you introduce the first batch of Swift components, Xcode provides a Swift header. You import it in existing Objective-C files to make Swift symbols visible. Normally, you don't see the header file in the project structure because it's generated on the fly. However, you can influence what goes into the file by annotating your Swift components with the Obj-C attribute. In the end, only the symbols which have this attribute become available to the Objective-C runtime. The Swift header has a counterpart, the bridging header. The latter is used for interacting with Objective-C code in Swift. But unlike the Swift header, the bridging one requires more manual work, just as everything else in Objective-C. You get an actual file in the project folder, and inside the file you list the components which should be available in Swift. I started with importing only the precompiled header, or PCH. In the Objective-C part of Caffeine's codebase, this file was responsible for importing the Cocoa framework and global constants. That way I didn't have to manually import them in each individual file. Up to that point, everything was going fine. But as soon as I imported an actual component of the app, something nasty appeared. An import loop. You see, Swift's module-based system is pretty smart about resolving dependencies between components. All the symbols that sit inside the same module can see and interact with each other. The most common case where this gets handy is when you define the delegate protocol. The component itself keeps a reference to the delegate declaration, but delegate methods often use the component's type in their signatures. With Swift being smart enough to figure out the relationship between the component and its delegate, you don't need to do anything extra, they just know about each other's existence. But the languages which use headers require you to think in advance. You cannot import the delegate's header in the component and then import the component's header in the delegate, because that would result in a cycle, sort of a chicken or egg problem. The compiler just doesn't know where to start resolving imports and dependencies. This problem is usually solved with forward declarations. You put one in a file and by doing so you're just saying, I won't import the actual header, but I can guarantee that this component exists. If you've been making software for a while, you know that just trusting the developer is never a good idea. But on the brighter side, you can go piece by piece and forward declare each component only when it's needed. It's possible to do so because each component has a separate header, so you sacrifice only a little. However, when one of the components comes from Swift, things become less convenient and safe. That's exactly because you have just one Swift header for the entire module. You lose that sort of granularity. At that point, the number of forward declarations in Caffeine's codebase grew dramatically, despite my attempts to start the refactoring with the most isolated components. So even though Swift is advertised as a more safe and reliable programming language, and it is undoubtedly, using it in a mixed environment takes some compromise. I'd say mixing Swift and Objective-C within a single module puts it in a pretty unstable state. Ideally, you should separate the languages at module boundaries. With some degree of pain, I did finish translating Objective-C into Swift. I'm not showing you a lot of code here because there wasn't much to look at. It was literally a line-by-line translation. And thankfully, I was able to remove everything Objective-C related at the end of the process. So the bridging header and the forward declarations were no longer needed. And here comes the more interesting part, where Caffeine gained an actual Swift flavor. The thing I was concerned about the most was time presets. If you used Caffeine, and if not, you'll find the link in the description, you know that it lets you specify for how long the app should be preventing the computer from going to sleep. Once the timer is fired, the normal behavior is restored. In the original version I cloned from GitHub, this was achieved through a combination of integer literals and magic numbers. For example, positive numbers denoted the timeout in minutes. -1 meant that the app should not disable automatically, and so on. You probably know that magic numbers are a code smell. They are literally an open gate for bugs and confusion. Luckily, Swift provides a much better tool, enumerations or enums. Just to be clear, enums exist in Objective-C as well, but in Swift they are much more powerful. If I'd started refactoring the magic numbers before the code was written in Swift, I would have needed two entities. One for specifying whether Caffeine should auto-stop at all, and another for specifying the timeout. Swift let me encapsulate these features in a single enum with associated values. One more thing that's gotten a major overhaul was the icon displayed in the menu bar. It benefited from Swift as well, though to a lesser extent. Changes in the AppKit framework played a bigger role in the update after all. Plus, I had to fix a problem that didn't exist before. And frankly, I'm not really happy with the fix. Here's a quick overview of how the icon worked before the change. In older macOS versions, icons in the menu bar used to be just regular views. You could display anything and handle user interaction any way you wanted. A few releases ago, however, Apple began restricting the capabilities and deprecating the old APIs. In El Capitan, the properties and methods used for working with custom views got deprecated. You were given the button property instead, and were supposed to do only two things: set an image or title that displays in the menu bar, and specify the menu which opens on click. Not some arbitrary action, but a concrete NS menu instance. I assume Apple did so for two reasons. On the one hand, it wanted to make manipulating the menu bar easier. And on the other, Apple's goal was achieving better consistency across all apps and all environments. Light and dark modes, different menu bar heights, you name it. I suppose these new APIs work pretty well for most of the apps, because who wants to mess around with drawn views and frames like it's 2008? However, Caffeine required a bit more flexibility. You see, the app appeals to many users because of its simplicity. When you want to disable the computer's sleep, you don't have to open a menu and select something from the list. Instead, you just click the icon. But at the same time, more advanced options are just one click away, except now you click with the other mouse button. AppKit's out-of-the-box behavior didn't support that, so I had to find a workaround. Initially, I wanted to continue using the deprecated view property and only convert it to auto layout. But macOS Ventura didn't want to give up that easily. Eventually, I gave up and switched to the new button property, so a separate component for the menu bar icon was no longer needed. However, dropping the one-click activation was absolutely not an option, because as a user, I would hate the sudden complication. As a result, I came up with a somewhat dubious solution: tracking button events target action style and handling them manually. You know, when one of the mouse buttons is pressed, Caffeine activates immediately, and when the other is unpressed, the menu opens. And yeah, I said unpressed, it was a mistake. Just as the solution was around the corner, I suddenly found another quirk in the menu bar logic. Apparently, if the menu opened as the button was pressed down, it didn't unpress automatically. I researched other icons but didn't get any conclusive findings. Some of them showed a menu with either button pressed down. Others only responded to the left one, and a couple apps didn't do anything until the button was released. These results had gotten me stumped, so I decided to just leave it as is. Maybe I'll revisit this thing down the roadmap. Speaking of the roadmap, Caffeine, just as all of my side projects, is first and foremost a playground where I can learn and practice with new technologies. Strictly speaking, the entire Swift transition wasn't really needed. The app worked pretty fine without it, but I wanted to challenge myself at how much smaller and more elegant I can make Caffeine's code. I'd say I'm satisfied with the results, and that little icon quirk will be the subject of my next Caffeine-inspired research. But a much bigger research subject will be SwiftUI. I'm still skeptical about it, especially when it comes to Mac apps. I can't say for sure that Caffeine will transition to that framework, in part because doing so would require dropping older macOS versions. But again, Caffeine is a play and learn project to me, and that's what I enjoy about software development. It lets you learn every day. That's it for today's video. If you found it helpful or entertaining, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Swift Bird. You also help me maintain this channel when you sponsor it at the links below. I'll see you later, next week probably. And until then, have a great time.